Mr. Guan, thank you very much. My fellow Singaporeans and friends, thank you all for coming out in such numbers today. Thank you. You join the many other thousands who are watching at home because of the courtesy of live streaming by the Online Citizen. And Terry Su of the Online Citizen does a tremendous job at all these events. Mr. Guan spoke about Robert Kennedy and how he was appointed by his brother John F. Kennedy as the Attorney General of the United States. One other point that many people fail to realize is that Robert Kennedy had actually been a prosecutor during his career. Not a long career as a prosecutor, but a prosecutor nevertheless. And I think that experience as a prosecutor is important when you occupy the position of the Attorney General, because you are invested with a lot of prosecutorial discretion. Who to prosecute, who not to prosecute. Lucien Wong, I will say this, is perhaps the best commercial lawyer Singapore has produced for a very long time. But it is also fair to say that he has never practiced litigation during his career. So I do not want to engage in a further debate on this subject, but I think people should know the facts so that we all know whether at the end of the day, a person who's appointed to one of the great state offices can do the job properly. Now, my friends, a lot has been said in the past month about the abuse of power and the rule of law. You know, during the height of the Watergate scandal in the early 1970s, President Nixon famously said, "When the president does it, it is never illegal." And we know what happened to President Nixon. The United States Congress pressed 3 articles of impeachment against him: abuse of power, obstruction of justice, contempt of Congress, because he destroyed evidence or tried to destroy evidence. He became the first, and till today, the only president to have resigned the office. And the United States Congress, when they pressed charges of impeachment against him, was sending a loud message that you may be the most powerful person in the land, but you are subject to the law, you are not above the law. They expressed, through their action, they expressed what a very famous English-American political philosopher, Thomas Paine, said in 1776. In America, the law is king. And throughout history, for hundreds of years, my friends, throughout history, for nearly 1,000 years, people have always had to contain the tyrannical and despotic tendencies of their rulers. The English are very proud of the fact that over 800 years ago, they extracted from a very reluctant King John the great charter known as the Magna Carta. And this Magna Carta rejected any notion that the supreme power in the state is unbridled, is unaccountable. So the king has to obey the same law as an ordinary citizen. And the English demonstrated this to tremendous effect in 1649 when they tried and they executed a king, King Charles I, who had been engaged in a long civil war with Parliament. Over the span of 5 years, 1 out of every 10 Englishmen died on the battlefield. Eventually, the king's forces were defeated. He was captured as a prisoner. Parliament set up a special court to try him. They tried him on charges of treason and tyranny. And when Parliament proposed that, you know what was the initial reaction? England then had 3 chief justices from the 3 common law divisions. They all told Parliament, you can't do that, because the king can do no wrong. The king is the law. And when they tried to get lawyers to draft the charges against the king, no lawyer wanted to take up the task. Eventually, they found a radical barrister by the name of John Cook. And reluctantly, they had to appoint him as a Solicitor General to press charges against the king. And John Cook drew up the charges. And the charge basically read, you, the King of England, you are not a person. You are an office. And the occupant of that office has limited powers, which he has to exercise within the restraint of the law, the laws of the land. And, my friends, that really was the start of what today the world knows as the rule of law. When we say the rule of law, we mean, besides other things, a system to check the powers of state and make sure that our rulers do not overstep the boundaries. Now, in 2 years' time, we will celebrate the bicentennial of our founding. In 1819, Raffles landed on our shores and founded Singapore. And from that time onwards, the British bequeathed us this system called the rule of law. Many of our forebears came from various parts of Asia, from China, from India, from Malaysia, from the Indonesian archipelago. Many of them were indentured laborers, which means they came here under contract to work, very often for free, in exchange for a free passage to a new country. But by the end of the 1800s, Singapore had become one of the great port cities in the world, one of the great metropolises of Asia. They may have started out poor, but many became prosperous and built a better life for themselves. And they were able to do this because of the rule of law. And you look at all the other colonies which were under the rule of the British. Hong Kong, America, the same thing happened. So we are fortunate in the sense that the most precious thing that the British colonial masters ever bequeathed us was the rule of law. But our forebears didn't have that fortune when they were in their native land. If you were in China in those days, you were subject to the whims and the caprices of warlords, of native rulers. If you were from India, you had to contend with the Rajas, the Thakus, the Nawabs. There was no unifying law. Many of our neighbors are not so fortunate. I give you an example. You look at Indonesia. For 350 years, colonized by the Dutch. And you know, for many of those 350 years, no Dutch citizen back in Holland had to pay any taxes, because Indonesia was so rich The Dutch Indies Company carted all the riches back to Holland. They plundered the country. They may have introduced Dutch law into the legal system, but there was very little rule of law. Instead, they used corruption, they used nepotism, they used favoritism to control the huge archipelago. And today, our Indonesian neighbors are still trying manfully to eradicate this terrible disease. So I say, let us be thankful for what we Singaporeans have over the years been accustomed to, the rule of law. It is something that all of us can agree on. And in a multicultural society where we have differences of race, color, religion, wealth, it is perhaps the greatest unifying factor for our country. But I am very sad to say that over the course of the last 1 month, we have come to realize that we do not have sufficiently robust institutions to ensure that this will carry on. I do not need to repeat because many of my friends before me have already done so. Grave charges of abuse of power were leveled against the Prime Minister and his government by his siblings. I am not as kind, and I agree with Dr. Ang. I am not as kind as Mr. Lau Tia Kiang, who said that the evidence was scattered, was vague. As a lawyer, in my view, there were at least 2 instances where the rule of law was not followed. Number 1 was the so-called secret ministerial committee. And I'm using a term, I'm using a term that the siblings themselves used. Although the Deputy Prime Minister Teo Chee Hian came out subsequently to say why the committee was not secret. But my point is this. That committee, to me, in its terms of reference, certainly in the second term of reference, where it said it was trying to determine the intention of Mr. Lee Kuan Yew with regards to 38 Oxley Road, that was unlawful. My friends, it is a very important feature of the rule of law that ministers, when exercising their power, must do so in good faith and within the boundaries of their authority. We don't suggest or agree to the Chief Justice making transportation decisions for the country or making investment decisions for the country. Likewise, those ministers had no business trying to determine what was the intention of Mr. Lee Kuan Yew with regards to his house. If I had been the siblings and I had received a letter from that committee, you know what I would have answered? My answer would have been, who are you? Who are you? Who gave you the authority to cloak yourselves with some judicial authority to determine what was the intention of my late father? And you know, what struck me as the second feature as being against the rule of law? The Prime Minister went to sign or swear a statutory declaration, giving his views as to what had actually happened with the will, or what the intention of his father was, his late father was. I thought that was totally inappropriate. You and I, as ordinary citizens, when we have a court judgment, and whether it is favorable or unfavorable to us, we obey that court judgment. And if we don't, there are consequences. We don't have the luxury of trying to circumvent that court decision through another route by submitting statutory declaration to a committee which, in my view, had no legitimacy or authority to examine on that point. It is what lawyers call a collateral attack on a court decision. And every public official, when he takes that oath of office, swears to uphold the rule of law, to uphold the law of the land. And if you remember when Bill Clinton was impeached by Congress in the late 90s, one of the articles of impeachment against him was that he did not fulfill his constitutional duties, and he, of all people, broke that oath to uphold the law. Now, I am not going to stand here making all sorts of accusations, trading arguments, whatsoever. Suffice to say, at the end of the day, to me, very serious allegations had been raised by the siblings of abuse of power. The Prime Minister chose not to sue them. He gave as the reason that to do so would be to besmirch his parents' name. I don't know, ladies and gentlemen. When I think of the law and I think of justice, I think of that Lady of Justice, which is familiar to many of us. You know, she has her arms outstretched, holding the scales of justice. She is blindfolded, to symbolize that the law shows no favor to race, to color, to relationship, to wealth. If he decided not to go down that route, there was a very clear route to take. It was to call for an independent commission of inquiry. You know, you cannot hide in a commission of inquiry. You have a commissioner, usually a judge. You may have several commissioners. The commissioner is aided by counsel, by lawyers. The siblings would have been represented by lawyers. The Prime Minister would have been represented by lawyers. All sides would have been cross-examined. All the evidence produced, not the drips and drabs that we had to take into account over the course of 3 weeks. One side would produce one correspondence, but where's the whole chain of correspondence so that we can make sense of it? We never had that. You know, when the Prime Minister told the nation, I am going to call a parliamentary session and I am going to answer, I am going to debunk all these baseless allegations, and MPs can ask me any question and I will answer them. We already knew that was not going to happen, right? It was not going to happen. What happened on the 3rd and 4th of July was a sorry spectacle that shamed Singapore. You had the PAP MPs standing up, yes, asking lots of questions, all standing up for their 10 minutes of fame, making speeches. At the end of the day, how many of those questions did the Prime Minister answer? Almost none. He was the accused, but in that arena, on the final day, he was also the jury, and he became the judge. And he cleared himself. He cleared himself. And he had support from his colleagues, people like Goh Chok Tong. When I heard Goh Chok Tong tell the Singapore people, you believe me in the integrity of the Prime Minister, because I brought him into politics more than 30 years ago. He was my DPM and all that. I was thinking, am I listening to the village chief, or what the Indonesians call the Kepala Desa? Because that is how justice operates in those countries. You listen to your village chief because he is the one who dispenses justice. So I tell the Prime Minister, if you do not want this taint to hang over you, like the sword of Damocles, call a commission of inquiry and debunk your siblings' allegations in there. Demolish them. His late father was very favorite of, was always used this phrase, demolish, debunk. You do the same in a commission of inquiry in the full sight of Singaporeans. And this is not something to trifle with. The rule of law and the abuse of process is the foundation of our political society. Even if it takes 1 year, 2 years, you do it. And you know what is the other thing that disappoints me from this whole episode? It is the failure of our constitutional system. We are supposed to have a constitutional system whereby the President has the powers under the Commission of Inquiries Act to call a commission of inquiry. He can do so when there are allegations about the integrity of the public service, about the management of any public division, or if he thinks that it affects the public welfare of Singapore. Section 2 of the Commissions of Inquiry Act. Throughout this episode, we have not heard a peep squeak from him. And the President has only 2 constitutional duties. 1, to safeguard our reserves, and 2, to protect the integrity of our public service. And on this most important charge, on this gravest charge, he chooses not to do anything. Now, gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen, the presidential elections are upcoming. Over the last 1.5 years, you have seen how the Constitution has been emasculated. The establishment has given us all sorts of arguments why it needs to be a reserved election. And I pray that Dr. Tan Cheng Bock will succeed in the appeal. I think S. Rajaratnam, one of the founders of the PAP and the man who penned the pledge, would be turning in his grave today if he knew what his successors were doing. And Look at how it was done. In the 5 long years after the last elections in 2011, the last presidential election, until the end of 2015, did we hear any murmur, any discontent from the ground, anything from any of the PAP politicians that the system couldn't carry on like that because for 47 years we have not had a Malay president? Nothing, nothing. Was it ever presented to the people in GE15 that we must refine the system, as the president put it when he opened Parliament in 2016? Absolutely nothing. And yet today they try to convince us. Their counsel in court, the Deputy Attorney General, suggested that this is for the sake of multiculturalism. And you know, they call this meritocracy. I ask you, for the upcoming election, whether it is a reserved election or not, you should go and ask every single candidate who desires to be president, will you, in the present circumstances, convene a commission of inquiry? We increasingly live in a society where every day we have to suspend disbelief in order to make sense of our country. We are told that it is quite normal, justifiable to have a 30% water hike, that our trains have to undergo delay because they have to test for signaling all day long, that we now need a reserved election. Otherwise, our society is going to implode. And I'm very often reminded of the story of that little child who called out to his parents, "The emperor has no clothes." My friends, we have a duty as Singaporeans to seek the truth, to speak the truth, and to spread the truth. Let us not allow the fog of propaganda by the PAP to cloud our judgment. I hope that one day we will not be so gullible as to believe if the PAP were to tell us that the sky is purple and not blue. Because if that day ever comes, I think a sadder fate will befall us. Then you may not have that little child, 7 or 8 years old. It may translate to that little gentle toddler, 3 or 4 years old. And if the mummy keeps repeating to that child untruths, propaganda, that little child is going to turn to the mummy and say, "Mama, I don't believe you anymore." I think that will be a very sad day. We have seen how our MPs in Parliament are not doing their job. Those feeble men and women of the PAP, the 82 of them or the 83 of them, at the end of the day, they will defend their party, they will defend their leader. And God forbid, if really a national crisis were to happen and the stake of Singapore was at issue, what will happen? I will not even trust them with the life of my dog. And so I say, it is time for us, ordinary citizens, to come together and to do more for our country. Many of you, I know, are active on social media. You are what many will call keyboard warriors. But it is time to do more. Every one of us has a talent. Every one of us has the passion. We don't have to rely on these so-called scholars who have run down our national enterprise, caused our assets to be sold. And so, I am announcing to you today, I am forming a citizens' movement called Project Freedom. I am going to ask for ordinary Singaporeans to come together, to work for our good, to come up with proposals as to how to build a better, fairer society. We may think that our job, our business, dictates our lives. But if you just pause for a moment, you realize that government policies is the determinant of how we live our lives, of how we control our money, of what sort of health care we get, what sort of help we get, if one day we really are unable to support ourselves. So I ask you, my friends, for the love of our country, let's come together and let's join in this common cause. Thank you very much.